I'm here with Michael again today, and we're going to be talking about Speaker's Meaning, which is this book by Barfield, where he's kind of making his case for the evolution of consciousness. And chapter 3, which is where we're at now, is the psychology of inspiration and of imagination. And he's talking about how the world moved from a psychology of inspiration to a psychology of imagination. He's also talking about how the world moved from, well, let's just get started. I won't try to do an introduction because I don't want to blow things too badly, but he does start in chapter 3 talking about the three different subjects of history, language, and literature. And mainly with literature, he's going to look at poetry because he wants to look at art and aesthetics. And he mentions that the theory of aesthetics is something that goes way, way back in our history, much more so than any theory of history or any theory of language, because those theories have been kind of more recent agglomerations. And so do you have anything you want to say about just kind of the overview of the chapter before we get started parsing it?
I'll just remind, for folks that haven't seen our previous videos on this series, the kind of this title of the book, Speaker's Meaning, refers to this dichotomy he sees in language itself, which shows up again and again in the book, where you have the lexical meaning of a word, which in a certain sense, a lexical meaning, it sounds like it's the dictionary definition, right? But that dictionary definition is sort of a snapshot of a point in time, right? Like if we wrote a dictionary today of like 2021, it would be different than, in some sense, and for certain words, much different than even 2020. We see these word changes are changing all the time. So, but there's a sense in which there's this communal shared thing he refers to as lexical meaning, which we try to give shape and definition to with things like dictionaries. But there's this other thing, which is speaker's meaning, which is a sort of ineffable way in which we try and communicate the fullness of thoughts, ideas, imaginations, artistic modes of being, that the lexical meanings of words never can quite get to it. There's always some way further we want to go, and so we nudge with our words, and we mean something different, or we don't, maybe we have a very limited vocabulary in a certain space, so we have to like pick up something that's kind of ill-fitted for the task at hand, but we mean something completely different, or something maybe nuanced on the existing meaning. And so the interplay between these two things is really kind of what the book's about, and kind of shows up again in this chapter as well. But that's kind of the foundation of the book, and foundational, his whole pursuit of the evolution of consciousness, his whole evidence for it is all based in language. And so he goes very deep with words and their meanings.
Right. So he goes back and he looks at specific words, how they have changed through history, and that those change points also indicate big shifts in history. And he looks at that as primarily the history of our consciousness, that our consciousness has changed in large ways at various points in history, which is one of the reasons we've talked about him in regards to Ian McGilchrist in the past, right? So one of the examples he gave, I think it was in chapter 2, is the word focus, that there was a time in which focus had a very specific meaning. It was the hearth in the home, the place where the fireplace was. So it might include the idea of a nice roaring fire or the center of the family. And then it came to mean, was it Galileo, or was it?
It was Kepler.
Kepler. It came to mean in astronomy and cosmology, the focus of an ellipse. And then, of course, from that, it started to become the meaning of focusing light in a certain place. And so it started taking on a much broader meaning after that. So that's the kind of example that he's talking about, where there are these big shifts in consciousness that take place. And that was a major shift forward into scientific thinking and breaking things down and being able to measure and think about how ellipses function and so forth. So that's one example from chapter 2, which I think we went over in some degree of detail in the past. But getting into chapter 3, where he talks about this theory of art. Well, first of all, he says there's two possible causes for a shift. One is that the thing itself has remained the same, but the way of thinking about it has changed. And the other is that the thing itself has changed.
Yeah.
And
So he's talking about so you could have like a static set of assumptions, like well, let's assume, for instance, that the laws of nature have always been the same. They're just static from the beginning of time on. So then if we look back through our different theories on that, he would say, well, the underlying data hasn't changed, but our theories have gotten better and better in terms of approximating that data. But he says when we talk about things like art, history, language, etc., we have this additional problem that maybe it's not just our theories are changing, but actually the data, the thing itself being examined, is changing as well, which of course, with his theory of the evolution of human consciousness, he absolutely believes is going on. So that he says that kind of further complicates things. And when we look at these, we have to take both into account, which is why it's so layered and kind of rich.
Yeah, so one of the words that he brings up here that he wants to talk about in relation to inspiration and imagination is the word creative, because the word creative took on a completely different meaning starting somewhere around the 17th century, or actually it started being used in relation to art and aesthetics around the 17th century. And so it's a little hard to go through piece by piece in the chapter about this, because it's kind of the big idea of the whole chapter, right? So I'm just going to review a little bit from page 47 and 48. He says that in Plato's thought, an artist was there were some failings in being an artist, because an artist could only produce imperfect copies of nature, and nature was already an imperfect copy of the ideal. So there were two removes. The artist is just doing a kind of mimesis, just imitating nature. And of course, they can't do a perfect imitation of it. And then nature itself is an imperfect imitation. So there's two removes there. Later on, the Neoplatonists came along and they said, well, artist is not really imitating nature, but the artist is trying to get at the archetypal reality behind nature. So there's only one remove, really, because they're trying to represent that archetypal view behind nature. But even at that point, it was still an idea that the artist was being inspired, that there was an inspiration coming into the artist, or that there was a kind of genius from outside that was inspiring the artist, that the artist was being possessed by this genius. And in our more modern world, the more modern view of creativity is that the artist possesses a kind of genius, that the artist is creative in the sense of being able to achieve something on their own, of having a vision and making something. And so he sees this trajectory from an outside influence to everything coming from inside out now. Does that kind of...
that I would say that's a lot of what the chapter is doing, is showing that progression over time, where it kind of moves by degrees from, like, I think he mentions maybe something like the Delphic Oracle, where it's almost like they're completely possessed, like it's almost like it's an ecstatic state that comes upon them, not even of their own volition at all. And then it sort of moves further down to a point where he would say it's more of a almost like an act of passivity to try and get out of the way of this sort of creative muse or spirit to come in and have its way through you as a medium. And then to more the modern day, where we see us as in some, there's still a sense in which we're kind of having some sort of communing with an outside force, but it's really, we conceive of it as something, we would say today someone is a genius versus saying that they have a genius, because we see that as being fused and under the control of the artist to kind of take from the outside, but volitionally, take something of his own persona and, something deep within himself to fuse that with what's coming from the outside to create this new thing that we refer to as creativity.
Yeah, but I think some of the modern lingo around that would be, I need to get into a flow state, as though it's something I can achieve. I can find my way into a flow state, rather than this inspiration comes upon me and I have to try to represent what the inspiration is giving to me. One of the things that made me think about, this is probably a peculiar thing, but I was thinking about how a lot of art, talk about art nowadays, is that people will say, oh, well, anything can be art. There should be no judgment. It's all, you're just expressing yourself. So expressionist art, the idea is that whatever's deep inside of me, I'm going to put on the canvas. And if there are other people that like it, great. Maybe it communicates something to them that is deep inside of them, and there can be a connection made or a relationship through that. But it has no connection whatever to trying to represent something that is real in the world.
Right. It's completely volitional.
Therefore, there can't be any judgment about it. And I started thinking about that word judgment and how judgment relates to ideals. Jordan Peterson always says the ideal is a judge. And the idea, for us, the ideal is a judge because we look at the ideal and we see how far we fall short of it. And so we feel judged by it, right? But there's another way in which the ideal is a judge, that where it's still operating in our world today. And that would be through something like a dog show or a horse show, where the judges have an idea of what this ideal dog is supposed to be. You can look at a kennel show and they'll have 20, 30 different breeds, and only one of them wins, not within their breed, but they win over all the other breeds because they represent some sort of ideal form of a dog. So the judges have this ideal in their minds, and the same with horses. They have an ideal of what makes an ideal horse. And I think that's one of the places where we can still see the old meaning of judgment, the old Platonic view of ideals. We can still see that in the world today.
Yeah. It's definitely there in the language. Here's the question. I'll put this to you. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but does the ideal change, or is it stay the same?
Well, and then you have to ask, and this sounds really going round and round, but is the idea of ideal the same as it used to be, or has the idea of ideal changed? Now, if you look back at art history and you think of, say, Michelangelo talking about releasing David from the rock, he was just chipping away everything that wasn't David. Now, in the chapter here, he talks about the history of sculpture there was some guy named Phidias who did a colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia, which is no longer existing. In the 1st century AD, there was a guy named Dio Chrysostom who said that Phidias had the difficulty of, when he's carving this statue of Zeus, of keeping, because maybe the statue took a couple of years because it was so big. So he had to keep in his mind the whole time what Zeus looked like so that his statue would be consistent over time as he's producing it, that he still had that picture in mind. Later on, the idea was, well, Phidias wasn't really using a model of Zeus that was in his mind. So he was making a model of Zeus in his mind and then representing that model that he was making. So there's this idea that okay, certain things, certainly the ideal has changed. And if you look back at some of the art, I don't know, is it 17th century art, when women were represented as being so buxom and, you know, that female beauty was laden with lots and lots of fat.
Yeah.
And that was what was beautiful. That was the ideal female. And art represented that. Nowadays, art represents an entirely different feminine ideal. So that in that sense, ideal has changed, but we still have the idea of ideal, that there is an ideal. We still have that idea.
Yeah.
But
I think
now whether
this
you
is...
go back even beyond that and say, I don't know what you think about the Platonic idea of forms. If there are forms, then is there some form that everything is supposed to be moving towards in this telos that is an ideal form that we can't see? I don't know.
Well, this gets into some of the conversation we were having before we started recording, because I think there's something really deep and mysterious going on here. You can't talk about ideal without getting into the divine really quickly. And I do think what part of what Barfield's trying to draw our attention to is that it seems there's real ontological changes, not just in human psychology, but in whatever sort of ground of being we inhabit, that there's some sort of change taking place there as well. That is real. And he's pointing to language as kind of his primary means of investigating that. But so for instance, for me, when I look back at Plato talking about the artist as unreliable because of course they're creating a copy of nature, which itself, and they're doing so imperfectly, which is an imperfect copy of the forms. I think it's a very impoverished view. And earlier in this book, Barfield talks about this earlier notion of what history is, which is a fall from a golden age, right? So we were like in this sort of like, and really much of art, literature, et cetera, was trying to recover something of that. It was trying to take some of the treasures of that golden age and make sure that they were somehow saved and procured for future generations and brought, into the present and transmitted forward through time. And there was always this sort of sense of loss in that process, because it was always a sense of like we're always making an imperfect copy of an imperfect copy of an imperfect copy, and just this tremendous kind of loss. And I do think there's something I think we're in the middle of now. This is my own personal opinion, where I think we're going to be forced to see this. We're going to be forced to kind of grow up and take responsibility for the ways in which our actions and choices have real effects on human consciousness, not just within ourselves, but a lot of this is latent in Peterson and him saying that, like, nothing even the way you think inside yourself has real consequences for your community and for the world around you. There's something, and he just, of course, he keeps everything at the psychological layer and in terms and analyzing how those thoughts play themselves out in your actions. But I would say, a la Barfield, that you're participating in spiritual realities that shape the future, even in your own private thoughts, which again, that's a huge weight of responsibility to think, but I think is actually true. And I think this has to be the case if we take the New Testament witness of, again, God and man becoming one in the eschaton, and the question of what's involved in that process. How does the infinite and the finite fully come together? And one of the things, when you think about it, you're like, well, can that ever happen at some point in time? Can you ever get to some point where okay, these two things are fully integrated and we're done? To me, it intimates a forever process, further up, further in, where from my perspective, we are being shaped by God's agapic love, but he's also creating this sort of space of possibilities where we have choices that, man, have real effects on who we become, but also the people around us, the communities we're a part of. They go out in these sort of morphic fields into infinity of what does the divine story look like at the very end, and versus this sort of, I think, an impoverished view of there's some sort of perfect, and we're descended from it, and we're always falling from it, and always trying to make another less perfect copy of a less perfect copy. That instead, God is actually active within all these choices, and he's actually using our desires to entice and lure us on towards an intertwining cooperation with these ideals, such that what his purposes are for us are achieved, in spite of all the what we perceive, and I, if I'm at all honest, just is just chaos, and seems like it's very easy for me to embody and imagine and live within that realm of, we're just descending and we're just kind of in free fall away from that divine ideal, and there's no hope to turn it around, because look at us, look at how deceived we are, look at how frail we are, look at how cowardly we are, look at how we would choose the lie over even the least bit of conflict. There's not any hope.
That's so close to what I was listening to. I was listening to Bishop Barron this morning, and he was talking about that view that you're describing right there. It sounds a little bit like what he was saying was the one flaw he sees in the Augustinian view is this very falling. Everything is,
and I think that's deeply in the West at a level it is, I think Paul mentioned this in one of his videos when talking about the current wokeism, that it's an Augustinian anthropology on steroids. It's this sort of this hopeless view of the essence of what we are. And I think in some sense there's a correctness to it, because it is what we are, absent God's love and transforming power. But if that transforming power is just back in Genesis at let there be light, and we're just falling away from it continually, and that's where I say the incarnation is this huge thing that if not fully embrace the mystery of what's being revealed there, we lose sight of this actual capacity for death and rebirth that is meant to be learned in the cross.
Well, and so the incarnation is not only that moment in time, but it's this ongoing incarnation that's continuous. And that's part of
It's
that.
in the church.
Yeah. And that's part of that thing that you were talking about, where this little thread of interest pulls us forward, this little shining pulls us forward and gives us a vision of what could be. And that's part of that, even though maybe we're more focused on imagination now than on inspiration because of the falling away of belief in God, still this ability to be inspired comes at us through books and movies and even watching cats and dogs on the internet. You can have this feeling that there is something more. But so that's kind of, we're going to talk about twos and threes today. I think that there's three things here in what you were talking about. One is this idea of the golden age, that we're falling away from a golden age. And I think that there is some truth to that. And if I just think about it historically, I had talked earlier about Michelangelo's time period. He came of age during a time period when Rome was just being kind of refurbished. Rome had kind of fallen into destruction and fallen apart. And somewhere around 1400, something like that, they started digging up to build some new buildings in Rome. And they happened upon these statues that had been created thousands of years before. They had no idea that such beauty was possible. And it was the beauty of those old statues that inspired Michelangelo to higher heights and to produce the beauty that he produced. So even as we're falling away from a golden age, it is possible to recapture some of that vision of the ideal and move back towards it. But then you talked about the consequences of human choices. And I look at what's happening in our day to day. We are actively trying to destroy that capacity for inspiration, right? We're tearing down the statues. We're tearing down all of the people that have inspired us in the past to greater accomplishments. But at the same time, that seems to fit into what Barfield is talking about when he's in Saving the Appearances, his book about idolatry. At the same time that all of those people from the past were inspiring us to something greater, the postmodernists have this, or at least the woke people have this correct, that they all had feet of clay as well. And there's a bad side to those guys, which fits right into Barfield's idea that the idols, maybe the idols had to come about in order to show us that we need to be scrubbed clean of all of this potential for paganism, to be falling back into paganism. And the only way that can happen is when these things are exposed. But in the exposing of it, we're also destroying the potential for inspiration. So
well, it's like we're replacing old idols with new idols. But I do think this mode of being, we talked, you kind of made a mention of the two-ness versus three-ness. I think the idols are always in that frame of the two, because it's always in this either or frame of again, being on the right side of history, being like there's only two options. There's the good and the bad, and seeing and trying to constantly eliminate the bad and kind of this sort of either or mentality versus the real complexity that is there in the. I mean, if you just attend to and look at the world and keep looking, you see the other complexity. Or if you just even talk to a single personal case versus look at trying to deal with it in some sort of generic or generalized, overarching view of like the patriarchy or systemic injustice or things of these natures. Like when you deal with them at those levels, there's always this wiping away of that complexity. But I think you're right. Like it seems to me like we're in the death throes of like trying to see how far can we take this ideation into idols process. Like how many layers can we go? Even as there's this iconoclasm with pulling down the idols of the past, it to me, the postmodern movements feel like just a deeper and more insane expression of modernity. Like they're tearing down the house modernity built, but at the same time, in sneaky sort of ways, trying to keep it around as well for the benefit of certain individuals, right? Or certain classes of individuals, right? So like they want to, in a certain sense, they want to keep the hierarchy, but they just want to invert it so that they're on top of it. And I think this whole thing's going to fall down at some point. I don't know what that looks like, but it's the church is right in the throes of it because the church has kind of lost its identity, and so I do think we were just describing there with Michelangelo covering these statues. He discovers these statues after they're long and buried. So there's a death of Rome that makes possible the Renaissance, right? So I'm not so certain that there won't be a death of, to some significant degree, with whatever we think of as modern civilization and our modern senses of what Christianity is as well, before there's a rebirth. And I think that's going to be really scary for people who don't see that God is active and working even through something as serious and significant as death.
Well, I mean, that has to be a lack of awareness of history, though. I mean, if you just look at the history of the time since the incarnation, we've gone through many.
I think most people are aware of it.
Was destroyed.
So I'm preaching, like when I'm talking here, I'm talking to myself as much as anybody else, like, because intellectually I'm aware of all this history, but I have as much embodied fear and anxiety and perhaps even reluctance to put my own skin into the game in such a chaotic environment as anybody else, so
I think I see where you're coming from. Yeah. I mean, I've thought about that a lot. I sort of cavalierly mentioned the history. We can look at it in the history books, but to be one of the people who was there at the crux point in every one of those historic turnings, when the barbarians were at the gates, or when the Anabaptists were being slaughtered because of their beliefs, or at every one of those points in time, those were real people dealing with real issues, with real fears and anxieties, and
even not even to be the person dying, but to be the witness to it. Like how do you react to that? What does that mean to you? Like, where is God in the midst of this is a very, until you're in the midst of a similar event, you don't really know how you're going to react, how really prepared you are, even if you've read, all the history books, and even if you've, have an intellectual philosophy around these certain things, you don't really know what you believe until push comes to shove and you have to act in some way. But it feels like I don't know. I just, like I said the other day in an email to you, I was, I feel like it feels like everybody thinks, it feels like everybody intuits that we're kind of moving towards some sort of cataclysmic apocalyptic sort of, you know, coming to terms with all our sins. But everybody interprets the meaning of that separately, and like from their different political positions about who's to blame and who do we need to throw overboard to be to try and avert this disaster, etc. But I don't know, it feels, I think maybe I'm just trying to come to peace with it in my own mind that this, I don't know, that it's going to happen, but that it still can be the work of God.
Well, we have a perfect way of kind of observing it through a lens where we can step back a little bit and look at a couple of examples of what's happening right now. And I'm sure this is happening on both sides of the political aisle. But if we just take an example of maybe that guy that was a baker, and when he was asked to make a particular kind of a cake, which he said, based on his faith, he couldn't make that cake. He would gladly sell any other cake to these customers, but he couldn't make that cake. Okay. That resulted in the loss of his business, his ability to make a living. And he was not alone. There were a lot of other people caught in that same maelstrom. Or you have some people nowadays on both sides of the political aisle, on both sides of the intellectual perspective, who for whatever reason don't want to get vaccinated. And if they don't, they are going to lose their capacity to make a living. I saw one yesterday, woman who's been a surgeon for 30 years. And she didn't lose a single patient to COVID last year. And she's done, amazing work in helping people to get better and with all her surgeries and everything. But because she personally has some issues with getting vaccinated, she's being terminated.
Yeah.
So here's this person who had put all this time into developing a career, and it's over. Now, those are sacrifices made for a certain belief. We may not agree with the belief one way or another, but it is someone who believes strongly enough in something that they're willing to make that kind of a sacrifice. Then I can look at that and I can say, if I had a belief that was that strong about something, and certainly I have to say that my belief in Christ is that strong, am I willing, if push comes to shove, to take that kind of a stand and see my life crumble? Or maybe even I could do that for myself, but if it means that my husband loses his career because of something that I did or say,
it
right?
becomes very complicated very quickly.
It becomes very complicated. And I think back to a book that I read about, there's Fox's Book of Martyrs, but there was also a book written about the martyrs of the 19th and 20th century. I don't remember the name of it. It's a beautiful book, amazing stories of people that, and one of them was during the Boxer Rebellion in China, when so many missionaries were killed, talking about this missionary compound where they came in and they didn't say to the Christians, either you recant or we're going to kill you. They said, either you recant or we're going to take all these servants that are working in your compound that don't even believe in your God, and we're going to kill them in horrible ways. Well, okay, what do you do? What do you do at that point? There's so many complications, so many and the book Silence is like that, right? I mean, when these Japanese Christians were forced to recant, because if they didn't, there were going to be these horrible things done, not to them, but to their families.
That's such a great example of how complicated it can be, where you have somebody who actually, at the end of the day, feels like, you have somebody who's all, I mean, they're a monk, they're already dedicated to Christ. They've already, you're going on the mission field, but now he ends up deciding that the Christian thing to do is actually to recant his Christian faith for which to him is the most precious thing in the world, but he knows it's going to save these other lives. And the complexities of that and the depths of the psychology are profound. And I think the question is what kind of world do we want to live in? And I think when all those examples you just gave, let's say you disagree with those people, you think they're wrong about the things that they have such profound convictions about. I would say that I would still want to live in a world where people felt the capacity and capability to more often than not share those deep convictions with others around them, even if they are not maybe they're on the completely wrong side of history. Maybe they're completely wrong. I would rather live in a world where those people were encouraged to stand up versus what we have now, which is a very much it's what I would describe as that two-ness again. It's an either or. You're either on my side or you're not. If you're not on my side, you're on the other side. I hope you die. Because you represent a threat to my existence, and because I'm so sure that I'm right and my side's right, you must be wrong and must be eliminated, but if you're not on it. And so there isn't even a place for in any sort of difficult problem solving endeavor, there's a million solutions. There's a million, billion, trillion ways to solve a problem, right? And there's no room for any individual to be honest about the sort of nuance and complexity that they bear witness to as an individual, their unique lived experience, which is going to take them in all kinds of strange and unusual ways. And we're quashing that right now. We're saying, no, you're either on this side, the right side, or you're subhuman.
Well, it's so interesting you brought that up as a two-ness versus three-ness, because one of the reasons we're talking about this is because of a video that I sent you from, is it three brown and one blue?
Yeah.
3 blue and 1 brown, where they do all the mathematical videos. And he's showing work with polynomials, and I don't understand the whole thing, but the idea is if you only have 2, you end up with very simple boundaries. But if you have 3, all of the boundaries have to have all 3 aspects at every single point in the boundary, because all the complexity takes place at the boundary. So that would mean that threeness indicates it isn't just one side or the other side. There's always this edge between, and all the complexity is taking place at that edge, right? So everything has an inside and an outside, but between the inside and the outside, there's a boundary. There are so many binaries in the world, but even every binary is connected by the pole. They're polar opposites, but there still has to be a pole, right? And so there's always a threeness in the world, and it's the threeness that makes things complex. Without the threeness, everything is just this simple one thing or the other thing. There's no, and so I've been giving a lot of thought to this whole idea of beauty being a matter of proportion. I've talked before in art about value from dark to light, or texture from smooth to rough, or all these various things that factor into making a painting. There always has to be this proportion. And in every work, the proportions are different. You might have more light in one painting, but less roughness and more color. So the proportions vary in every single piece, just the way the proportions vary in each individual human or in each animal. Even twins, there are still things that are different inside a twin because the proportions vary, right? And that's where the beauty lies, in the varying of the proportions.
Yeah, I really like that, because in that proportion, you already have a threeness. You have the two things, but you also have the relationship between the two things, which is just as important. And I do think I don't want to like, because I think there's a reason for the two-ness, and there's a usefulness and even a necessity for it, because, and I think this in some sense this is also why we have we've talked about, like, Ian McGilchrist's book and the structure of the brain. There's a two-ness built into that, which I think especially when it concerns action, taking action in the world, you're to do anything in real time, you really do have to distill things down to the very simple of act or don't act. Like it's got to get to that razor simple, or we, it's just the nature of our finite qualities and the limited amount of time and resources, other things. We couldn't survive in the complexity around us without that. So there seems to be this utility in that approach that we have to. It's for practical reasons. Sometimes you're in a situation like where your only options are: do I resign or do I not resign? Or do I speak my truth or do I hold my tongue? But or at least you feels that way in the moment. That's the level that you can get to in the moment sometimes, and I think that's fine, and that's just a product of our fallenness. That's where we're at. But reality itself, if you give it any sort of time and attention, again, it opens up this possibility. So in considering any sort of issue, if you will just allow yourself, instead of just saying that it's either this or that, if you just allow yourself that, just imagine there's a third possibility, that usually just that step in itself really can help. I think it can help you to see that there is way more there than you had first imagined. Like, it's just by just creating this space for another option, something transpires there that actually allows us to commune with the world in a deeper way.
Well, something just popped into my head, and I don't know if it's pertinent, but I'm going to share it because it might say something to you. There's this pastor named John Ortberg who's been doing a series on YouTube called Become. And his most recent series has been from the book Screwtape Letters. And his episode, I think it was yesterday or the day before, was reading a part from Screwtape Letters where the demon, the mentor demon, the teacher demon is teaching his nephew that there's the past and the future, and humans know a little bit about the past. So it's not so good to keep them in the past, because that might remind them of things that are going to draw them back to the good father. But do your best to keep them in the future, because that's where all the unknowns are and the anxiety lies there. And if you can keep them all wrapped up in the future and what might happen or what might not happen, or all the fears and anxieties involved in that, you're going to have a much better shot at destroying their faith. Whatever you do, keep them away from the now, because the now is the point that meets the eternal. Now, I just thought that was so interesting, because it brought to my mind all the stuff that Jordan Peterson has talked about with the known and the unknown, and the point between the known and the unknown, where you're standing at the precipice of the future, looking out at this field of possibilities, infinite possibilities. The only way you can make your way through that field is if you have a guide that comes from keeping your focus on the highest good of which you can conceive, which theologically is God.
I think that's where the eternal comes in.
Yeah. And then put that together with what he said when he was talking to Roger Scruton, when they were discussing the transcendent. And Jordan Peterson said, we meet the transcendent when we err. We meet the transcendent at the limits of our knowledge. When we get as far as we can go with what we already know, then we move past that and we make a mistake. That's the place where we meet the transcendent. But that's the now, that's this moment, right? Because this moment is filled with an opportunity to err.
Yeah.
And if you don't make a choice, to act or don't act, you're never going to discover.
Well, and I think there's something in there that in the doing, there's something in the doing which always pertains to the now, right? Where you do get that feedback, you get that, you learn, where you have real potential and capacity and capability, and you also learn the limits of where that is right now. Like in his example of like cleaning up your room, there's something very simple, but you can be quickly humbled in that process of something so simple by realizing your own lack of capacity for order, for diligence, for just keeping on a task from start to completion. All these things can manifest themselves to you in something very simple like that, which is very different than what you were describing, where there's this sort of reflection on the past or the future. It's all sort of virtual and mental, and there's a safety there in that virtual space of contemplation, because you don't have skin in the game. You're I think a lot of, we were talking about Gnosticism earlier, is the Gnosticism is about inviting people into that virtual space and spend all your time there. Don't get dirtied with the doing. That's too risky. It's unsafe. You might try something and people will laugh at you. You might have some truth about your identity revealed to you that's unfavorable, and so I do think there's a real Gnosticism in much of this desire to kind of have padded walls and like safe spaces everywhere. It's a lack of faith that being in the creation is good, and that we can trust ourselves to it, that we can take our like small little creative impulses, and that can somehow be married to the divine impulse and actually create real things that are good. There's this, I don't know, I think about that kind of that Matthew impulse is like, to who has, more will be given, and to he who has not, it's going to be what he, it doesn't even almost make sense, but even what he doesn't have is going to be taken away from him. There's a certain sense in which that's the battle, I think, is kind of the invitation into the real.
Well, can I take it back to silence? Because all of this really brings up a question for me. And I remember I read that book, Silence, when I was a missionary in Japan. So 1986, maybe I read it, 86, 87, something like that. And it was very, very troubling to me reading that book. It's a very painful book to read, and confronts very, very difficult questions for which there don't seem to be any easy answers. But what if he had not denied Christ? What if he had spoken the truth? Jordan Peterson always says, speak the truth, or at least don't lie, because whatever comes out of speaking the truth will be the best good of which you can conceive. So, this is a huge question, and it gets into all kinds of things. It gets into like the whole issues of torture and all of these questions that we struggled with in this last century. And I'm not I'm not trying to judge in any way the choice that missionary made. I probably would have made the same choice, but was it the choice that really illustrated faith that God is ultimately good, and that speaking the truth will always bring forth the good? And okay, these are really hard things to talk about, but
Yeah.
let's say that in some of these situations where missionaries were given the choice, either you recant or we're going to kill your child. First of all, when you're listening to somebody say that to you, you have to be thinking, well, can I trust this person to follow through on what they say?
Mhm.
If I recant, are they going to spare my child, or is my child going to get killed anyway as soon as they kill me? Right? But let's say you don't have headspace, you don't have time to think through that kind of stuff, but all you can think about is Jesus said, he who holds me up before men, I will hold him up before the Father. He who denies me before men, I will deny him before the Father. We know, I mean, we have these passages from Scripture that tell us plainly that we must never deny Christ. And all of Revelation is filled with that, right?
Yeah. Well, I
So
would
let's
say,
say that I make the decision, I'm a missionary, and I make the decision, I will not deny Christ, and I have to watch my children die, and then I die. Or maybe the worst punishment would be that I watch my children die and then they let me live.
Mhm.
That would be even worse, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that could be even worse. But if I'm looking at that through a human lens, my human lens says the worst thing that can happen is for my child to die, not only for my child, but for me. But from a lens of eternity, my child is going to be with me in eternity. And yes, they didn't get to live life on this earth, but this is not the be all and end all, right?
Mhm.
Life with God is the be all and end all, if we really believe what we say. But
well,
when
I think what you're getting at, and what makes that such a phenomenal, I've not read the book, but I've seen the movie. But I think what makes it such a phenomenal story is that I don't think there is. It's obviously meant to put us into an imaginative space where because this is reality, right? I mean, it would we don't even know. I mean, there's decisions I made, 4 or 5 years ago that I still think about. Did I make the right decision? You don't know. And I don't think stories sometimes give us a sort of, sometimes they give us a sort of simple, easy answer, like, oh yeah, this guy made the right choice and therefore the good thing happened and they lived happily ever after.
Mhm.
But that this story seems to be a purposeful, like, digging underneath that. For instance, like, perhaps the missionary thought when he denied Christ and spat him that he was going to go to hell for that.
Mhm.
But in some sense, he was like Paul, who said, I would rather be accursed so that my fellow countrymen could be saved.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think Paul really meant that in some sense. Like, I don't know that we know the depths of, like, the decision making that goes into, like, I would rather go to hell so that someone else doesn't.
Mhm.
Um, and do we know what really happened, what really transpired? Do we know the depths of the reality that transpired? We don't. It's kind of ineffable to us. We're getting this glimpse into it via the story, but we don't know. And I think that, again, that's part of what makes it such a great story. It really, it's I'll use this term sophianic or sophia. It is this depth of mystery that is bottomless, that we could spend the rest of the day
Mhm.
exploring the different angles for how
Mhm.
one might experience
yeah.
that reality, how might somebody might do it in a very cynical way
Mhm.
versus how somebody might do it in the very spirit and life of Jesus, motivated by him. So it's like, I don't know. I can slice and dice it a million ways, and I could find all those reasonable and intelligent, defensible ways of looking at it. But
Well, and
I
there's
don't
one of
know.
the other characters. I mean, I say characters. I mean, this was a true story, but maybe some of the side characters that he puts in the book are added for dramatic impact. I don't know, but one of the characters is a guy who early on denies Christ to save himself, but then later turns around and um, he did it in a very cynical way because he wasn't really a Christian to start with, but he got lumped in with the Christians because he was getting some sort of benefit out of hanging around with them or something. But he very quickly denied Christ because he wanted to save his own life. But later on, because of observing the witness of this missionary and what that he gave up in order to save all these other people, later on that guy turns around and becomes very faithful Christian and ends up giving his life to not recant in the end. I mean, rather than recanting in the end, he gives up his life. So I think that's the way it went. I might be a little mixed up on my details, but yeah, it's a very, very layered, very nuanced story. And last night, my husband and I watched the movie Life Itself. Have you ever seen it?
I think I have. Paul talked about it a long time ago, and I
Oh, he
think I saw it
did?
around. Yeah,
Okay. I never heard him talk
it's where
about it.
like it's like life itself is supposed to be a character in the story. It's got
The kind of the narrator,
yeah.
the unreliable narrator is probably as near to perfect as any film I've ever seen. I was really reluctant to watch it because a lot of times my husband will say, "Oh, this movie is really good. You've got to see it." And I'm like, a lot of times the stuff he tells me is good, I don't enjoy at all. But I said, "Sure, let's watch it." So he put it on, and I was so captivated from after the first 5 minutes or something. I was so captivated. It's like all time and space just stopped for 2 hours until that movie was over. It's just the script, the acting, the cinematography, the complexity of the story. It's just beautiful. And it gets at a lot of these things of you can see something happen and you think it's going to have a certain meaning, but then you see something else happen and that changes the meaning of that first thing. And then something else happens and that changes the meaning of the second thing. And by the end, it's changed the meaning of everything.
Yeah.
It's
I think in some sense that's a big part of our mission today, is changing the meaning of things that happened to other people before us. That's part of why we're all part of this salvific story. That maybe, again, as I was kind of like implying earlier, maybe that doesn't ever come to an end in some sense. Like maybe it doesn't, or it doesn't come to an end in the ways we imagine. Because when we were talking about earlier, like where, with these people that lay down their lives for different causes, they speak their truth, they share their experience, they follow their convictions at great cost themselves. And we can, depending on our perspective, we may look at those people and go, oh, they're idiots, they just, they're confused. Or we think, oh yeah, they're on my team and they took one for the team, and they're pushing our values down the field. But whatever the case may be, it seems like we all have something unique to contribute to whatever this story is. Like we're all somehow necessary, even though in the modern frame, I would say we're almost every day, it's kind of beaten into us that your little story doesn't really matter. You're just an anecdote on this big mass of stuff. What really matters is like that that justice is done on this sort of cosmic scale, or like this decision's made over here, and all. It really downplays the significance of the everyday, the material, the like the whether I'm kind and gracious or patient to the person, I'm interacting with at a store, or like these very small moments that actually are the very substance of our lives. At the end of the day, we're kind of encouraged to kind of throw them in the trash and be like, this isn't that important. Whereas I think there's something kind of unique in all of us that's being expressed all the time. And even more so, I think, again, I this further belief that God's working even in the worst of situations. Like, who was it? Oh man, I just forgot his name. He's a Catholic predecessor, Chesterton. He has this famous quote where he says, he talks about the man knocking on the door of a prostitute is actually looking for God, that God is using even all these twistings and perversions of our good desires, is leading us down past where he's at the end of it. Even though there's worse and better ways to go down that, I think. But I don't know. I just think there's a sort of wonderful trust we can have if we actually believe that God is fully present, working in all things, and even these sort of mundane things that we sometimes don't have. Because a lot of times, why do we focus on the past or the future rather than where we are now? It's because we think whatever we're up to now, where we at in this moment, doesn't really matter. You're like in a conversation with somebody, and it's something about it's a little boring or doesn't capture your interest the way you are. So you like kind of you go off into dreamland here or there, because you don't have a sense that this has a real connection to the eternal, what's happening right now. And there's something to be said for a sort of attending to reality as if every single moment actually has this eternal connection, and that God is present here now, trying to communicate with me and trying to work out his plan, not only for me, but through me and in all these characters around me. And like that I have some real vital role to play in how that unfolds. Even if I'm part of the negative aspect. I mean, I'm the one that loses his temper and is the jerk at the wrong time. Even there, God, that's an opportunity for somebody for like, to show tremendous compassion and mercy to me that I don't deserve, that suddenly changes who I am from that day forward.
It's such a perfect picture of what happens in that movie, life itself. But also, I was going to say, Robert Barron thing today about Gnosticism, he was talking about Irenaeus, who he said was the great campaigner against Gnosticism in the 2nd century. And that one of the things Irenaeus said was, and this is a rough quote, I probably got it wrong, that one of God's greatest glories is man fully alive. It referencing back to the thing you were talking about with Chesterton, that even when we're on a bad trajectory, I think what this relates to is that at least if you're making choices, even if you're heading in a wrong direction, you're at least making a choice. You're at least saying, I have desires, as opposed to a person who, I often get into this thing where I don't really know what I want. I don't really know, you want to go here, you want to go there. Well, I don't know, you choose. I'm always willing to let other people choose, which is a very passive position to be in, right? But what I'm really saying is I don't really know what I want. I don't really know what I desire. And I feel way more fully alive when I make decisions about what it is I really want, even if the thing that I really want really makes me struggle with some aspect of my humanity, at least I'm making a choice. At least I'm saying, there is a difference between X and Y. And I kind of think that this tendency is all wrapped up in this whole problem with what's going on in the world today. You were mentioning that we have a tendency in the world to say, oh, the things that are happening at the human level aren't important. What's really important is this bigger project of perfect social justice or whatever. And I mean, that's part of the worldview difference between the importance of a person and the importance of people. You know, the thing I've often heard said is it's very hard to love people. It's possible to love a person, but you can't love people. And yet we're always being called to love people and to have justice towards people in this big abstract, because that's supposed to be of higher importance. But really, it's like in the military, no man left behind. They don't look at the military as just this conglomerate that is either going to win the war or not win the war. At least now, some nations do. They just look at their conglomerate, and each individual life is not important. It's whether or not they meet their goal. But in the American culture, every individual life is important, and everybody's got a buddy, and they're not going to leave their buddy behind. That's getting it down to the human level, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it is. I think, you know, ultimately underneath all this, this Gnosticism is really, it becomes a sort of nihilism, because, and I noticed this, I think I said this to Paul one time, one of the early chats I had with him, where I realized how nihilistic I had become. And even in my attempts to get away from it, I still was like, it was like nihilism was still kind of a default. Like I'd kind of like sliced my life into all these different categories or boxes. And the default in any of those categories would be a kind of nihilistic, you know, core. And what I mentioned to Paul was that kind of the benefit you get from that nihilism is you don't have to care, right? So like, you know, some aspect of your job or certain relationship or certain endeavor that you're trying to take on, you know, isn't going the way you like. This nihilism gives you a sort of free pass, because you're like, well, it doesn't matter anyway. It's all just a big nothing. It's all like, you know, whatever. And so it gives you a certain insulation from reality, you know. And so I think that's the real struggle today, is to enter into all these moments as if they're all real, and see that, you know, and oftentimes I kind of identify what you're saying about, like, you know, sometimes just like having the sense of like, I don't really know what I want, you know. But I realize, at least for me, some of what that is trying to protect myself from wanting something and then, you know, failing to achieve it, or being, you know, judged for having wanted the wrong thing, or like, you know, all those things, you know. And I think you're right. It's better. Like, a lot of times it's better to just maybe want the wrong thing, go after it, fail, and then realize, oh yeah, what I really want is X, than to just sit here and be like, you know, it's all big nothing anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we kind of strayed a little bit from the chapter, and I suppose you don't have very much time left, but we could finish this up and do a second go on this, because I think there is a lot. We got as far as page 52, I think, which is about halfway through the chapter. From the point he starts talking about Coleridge and communication and expression again, and then he gets into the whole historical transition. I think there are a lot of interesting things there that we could maybe pick up in a second go around. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
You want to try to finish it today? I don't know what's your time schedule.
We can finish it. I mean, honestly, I think we've covered most of it.
Well, I
I
had
would
a
say
couple
that,
of questions that I wanted to
okay,
ask you about.
sure, go ahead.
If you have time. Okay, so on page 52, he says, to think of Coleridge is inevitably to think of the psychology of imagination. Everyone has heard of his distinction between imagination and fancy, and I need not go into it. Well, I haven't heard of it. So I wonder if you could tell me what Coleridge's distinction was between imagination and fancy, because I think you've done more work on Coleridge than I have.
Yeah, I think what he's trying to recapture the use of the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty, as being in touch with the real, versus fancy, which is kind of like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to imagine a pink elephant, that is dressed in a ballerina dress. It's sort of like this.
So in that case,
It's
like
sort of novelty for the sake of
Tolkien's
novelty.
world would be imagination.
Yeah, I think. Well, I don't know. I guess it's. I'll have to dig into it. I feel like George MacDonald goes into this too, because I think George MacDonald had some connections to Coleridge, but yeah, for me, what the sharp line he's trying to distinguish between is this idea of being in touch with something outside oneself, which again goes back into this ideas of inspiration. I think he talks earlier about Coleridge saying, the true poet is possessing the spirit, not possessed by it, which he holds up as a marker in this sort of transition from the old way of thinking of like just being a conduit for your muse or genius, versus here you kind of, it's an act of will by the artist to possess the spirit. And I think this is also what he's seen the imagination. And I think this is a big part of what Barfield attributes, is that we are kind of moving into this world where, to some extent, we are being asked to forge our own meaning. And
This is where
do
he talks about the shift from the super individual to the individual.
Yeah, we and again, it's related to what I was talking about earlier with Peterson, and the idea that everything I do has these deep consequences, and that those are all burdened on me in those choices I make. But I do see that rather than some sort of like fixed ideal in the past that we're striving towards, there's something that we're being asked to cooperate with, and in some sense, what each human life is tasked with is the question of like, what do you want? But even more so, who do you want to be? Because that's really underneath all the what we want is the deeper question is, who do you want to be? And the scary thing is that we get to, in some sense, if you believe the mystics, we all get exactly what we all get to be exactly what we want to be. And that's kind of both wonderful and terrifying at the same time.
Well, especially in those moments when you just want to kind of give up, like I had a really bad week last week, partly because we had just been on 5 weeks of just a merry-go-round, just constant travel and constant being with people. And I'm kind of a introvert, and so to be with people all the time, I enjoy it, but then I get exhausted. And just before that, my daughter had moved out, so when I finally came home after 5 weeks, I'm coming home to an empty nest, and that has its own consequences, because life is very different. And it just sort of all hit me at once one day, and I just started spiraling down, just like, well, my life has no meaning. I have no purpose. Nobody cares about this dumb YouTube channel. I'm not really doing art anymore, so I don't have that identity. I just got down in this hole really bad. And that's not my nature. And so it really scared me. And then out of the blue, I got an email from a friend I hadn't talked to in quite a while. And she said, "Are you okay? I have a bad feeling about where you're at right now." And so I told her, I just emailed her back and I said, you're absolutely correct in your assessment. I'm not okay. I'm kind of scared of where I'm at right now. And she said, "Can I call?" She called me right away. And this is going to sound a little woo, but well, first of all, she told me that she had recently become much more committed to Christ in her viewpoint. And it was something that she and I had talked about many, many times. And previous to that, she had been a little bit more kind of in the new age space. And now she's like a totally committed Christian. It was just like kind of blew my mind talking to her. And then she said, "And it sounds to me like you're under attack because you have all these things going on that have a potential to really glorify God. And that's when the enemy attacks." Now, here's somebody who's a almost completely new Christian, and she's saying something to me that, of course, I know I've known for 40 years. And yet when it came into my own life, I wasn't recognizing it. And I kind of think it was an attack, because the minute she said that and my mind snapped back into alignment with what I know to be true, it's like the attack went away. It's like in a 5-minute period, I went from being in a hole to being like, "Oh yeah, life is good. God is good." You know, there's meaning and purpose to life. It's not all meaningless and empty. So very interesting.
Wow, that's a great story. I mean, that's what it shows everything we've been talking about in terms of just how the littlest things that we do in relationship with other people have the most profound consequences on their direction they're going. And we don't, it's both, I think, I think we're sometimes protected by the fact that that's hidden from us, but sometimes, you know, we need those glimpses of how profound, you know, our words, our actions, even, you know, maybe just our prayers are on other individuals.
Well, it's really funny that you should have framed it that way, especially today. It's so interesting because last night I was on Facebook and I saw that this young man who was the son of some friends of mine from 40 years ago, yeah, it would be about 40 years ago. I knew him when he was 4 years old and up until the time he was about 7. And then I went away to Japan and then I moved to California. And so I haven't seen him in all those years, except one time he was coming through town. He stopped with his family and visited me. So now he's in his mid 40s, probably. Very dedicated Christian, loves the Lord. He's a worship leader in his church. And he's just written a book. And his wife had said, "We're doing a little bit of crowdfunding to try to get this book published." So I just shipped off a little donation because I believe in him. And he wrote me a thank you note today. And he said, "You know, thank you so much for the donation." And he said, "Thank you so much for inviting my family into your home all those many years ago, because it changed the trajectory of my family's life and my life. And I am forever thankful." And all I did was there were some people that I knew through some educational stuff that we were working on. And we invited them to come to lunch after church. But in order to do that, they would have to come to church with us because they lived like 45 miles away. And so I said, "Why don't you come to church with us and then come on home and we'll." And so they came to our church and were kind of met by the Holy Spirit in that church. And the whole family, the little boy who was 4, he told his mama, he said, "I love this place. I want to come back here." And so they started coming to that church. And through that, the whole family became believers. And And here we
Wow.
are all these years later with this guy. He's now got 6 children and a wife, and they beautiful life. But it's this littlest thing that you do, and God makes it have these consequences that I could never have foreseen. And most of the time you'd never find out about it, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that he dropped me that note today and said that.
Yeah, I think it's like you said. I think that what's scary to think about is that those impacts are happening all the time, and they're happening on the positive side and on the negative side. The times where we aren't at our best, and I think it's I don't know. I think it's just a wonderful gift that, like, I think once we get a chance to kind of see the whole tapestry of the ways in which our story is entwined with others, I think it's a very beautiful thing, that I think that must be something of whatever eternity is meant to be, is the unraveling and the kind of reliving of some of that, and yeah, just the gratitude to I don't know, just it's just you start to realize that how much everything is just a real gift, like every little bit of it, even all the those hard moments you've go through, and it's always hard to see in the moment until you kind of get these perspectives. But yeah, I think that's just it's just true, and it's something that I don't think we even in the church, it's not something we get reminded of enough. This sort of perspective of just how wonderful the story we're in is.
Well, I like the way that you use the word gift, because, and I think that actually wraps up the chapter too, in a very interesting way for me. I may be misunderstanding him, but I kind of hear him saying that in this transition, he talks about poetry having changed from something that is given to something that has to be actively grasped or achieved, as this moment of change, the gift versus the achievement. So the gift fills us with gratitude. My achievement fills me with pride. And so there is this difference. But then I kind of hear him saying also that I think this is what he's saying, is that when it gets to this distinction between the lexical meaning and the speaker's meaning, that you can't go back in history to a time when there was something before the lexical meaning. You can't go back in time to a time when there was a word that did not have both an inside and an outside meaning. You can't go far enough back in history to find a time when words were only something devised by ape men grunting. If you actually look at the history, the way he's parsing it out here, and it's very complicated, the last few pages of this chapter, but I think what he's saying is even the lexical meaning was a gift.
Yeah. Well, he definitely points in that direction. I think that's for him, is because remember, he comes out of World War I as basically an atheist. He starts having, interesting experiences of consciousness in his engagement with poetry that are kind of unsettling to him in his materialistic mode of being. And then that kind of, and then he does in his early academic work, he does these investigations of language that leads him to the conclusion there's something weird's going on here, because and really what he's doing at the end of that chapter is he's just throwing a big wrench into the prevailing notions of how language developed in his day that are trying to have naturalistic explanations for it. Because what he basically accuses them of is saying, okay, you basically have the natural period, you have the prehistoric period, then you have the historical period. The historical period is once we get into the ability for the individuals, the Julius Caesars of the world, people that have an individual identity that we know about and we can kind of put ourselves into their shoes and identify with in some way. But all that develops, all those are layers upon language itself that allow for such a thing as history. And this sort of evolution of consciousness that we associate with the historical period. Once we start being able to have real individuals with identities that we can reconstruct stories around, that all relies on language. And he's saying like, these guys are assuming a historical period prior to all this, out of which the quote unquote given stuff evolved from. And that's where that got this whole thing going. He's like, where does that come from? Like there was a historical period prior to the prehistorical period in nature itself, where it's just instinct and evolution guiding everybody. So he throws some real, he doesn't really reveal in this, maybe he does in the final chapter, but he doesn't here really reveal it. He's more kind of just throwing, he's like kicking out the chair from the prevailing theories of his day. It says like, you're assuming something that you're providing no evidence for. And it's kind of nonsensical. He talks about that they're basically trying to move forward and backwards in time simultaneously to kind of cover up the gaps and have a coherent theory. And he says there just really isn't any evidence for it when you look at the history of language, which I've always had a problem with myself. Like, like how, like, because yeah, I mean, it's how does, I just don't think there's enough time, for human species to just kind of evolve these sort of grunts into the complexity we have today. And
if you study the history of language, but I mean, one of the things I had to do as an English major back in the late 60s, the book, The History of Language, I don't know if it's the one he talks about, but we did have a book called The History of Language. And it showed all the different language families. And that if you trace the vocabulary and the grammar of each language family back, they're out here, out in the periphery, all over the world. And you start tracing them back, and they all are moving back towards the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah.
Where there was some sort of ideal, they didn't use this terminology, but there was some sort of ideal language which you can guess at, but you can't get at.
Yeah.
But you can tell that there's all these little pieces in each other language that are related to some way that language used to be, but it was nevertheless, it was a language. And then if you look at each one of those languages, they started out at a high level of complexity and over time have become more and more simplified. It doesn't go the other way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the other thing he points out too, is like, he's saying that this idea that like, okay, we had like, apes like creatures that were kind of grunting and pointing at something. So they had a certain grunt that meant tree, but just meant the tree. Like we don't have any linguistic evidence for there ever being a time where things just had these outer meanings. There's always this kind of rich inner living quality to all the words that, because part of what he says is like all these old mythologies, who was it, Max Muller, that called language was a disease of myth, that language only came into being to support these mythologies. And then the mythologies were mistaken later for literal, like, but it presupposes this distant, race of poets that, somehow had language bequeathed to them, and in a lexical way, such that they all kind of could collaborate and layer on these poetic meanings on top of it. I mean, a lot of it, like you got to just speculate about, because again, we don't have. Once you get into prehistory, where there's no real evidence, and so coming up with a cogent explanation of that, it's pretty difficult, I think. But there's definitely enough to kind of throw under the bus the at least the prevailing theories than his day. I don't know what I haven't. It's something at some point I would like to do, is do a more thorough investigation of how things have evolved since his time, in terms of how things are thought of. There's, that guy, John McWhorter, you've probably run across him.
Yeah.
He has a series on Audible that you can listen to that I've gone through, but it doesn't go back to any sort of theory of language itself. Maybe that's something they've given up on altogether because it's too difficult, or it has some of the problems maybe that Barfield was gesturing at. But he talks much more about just how we've seen languages change, how they combine together, how different languages interact with one another, to change the language. And that was a really interesting course. Very, very interesting, how, things like all the Creole languages, Creole languages are basically like a language where like it's like a non-native speaker. So they come in with like a very rudimentary understanding of it, and it becomes kind of a scaffolding to sit upon all their experience and other linguistic stuff from their like variety experiences. So all the American Creole languages are very, very kind of strange and interesting. Like, I don't know, comminglings of languages that are really interesting. But that,
Well, I mean,
I haven't.
English is like that because there kept being all these different invasions of the Germans and the French and the English and everything all in the same place. And so English sort of became this amalgam of all these various languages all stuck together.
Yeah. And English is, because it's now succeeded as being the kind of the lingua franca of the world, that number one language spoken in the 21st century is going to be badly spoken English. And that's going to change English in interesting ways all over the world too. I don't know what the effects of that'll be, but it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Did you ever see that sci-fi series Firefly?
I don't know. I saw at least an episode there. I remember that was like a cult hit, but I don't think I saw the whole series.
I never heard about it until like 5 years after it was over. Somebody told me about it, so I watched it, and there's only one season, but I clearly understood why it was a cult hit. Just fascinating. But it's a time in the future when humanity is out colonizing a bunch of planets in another star system. And there's two main languages spoken, English and Chinese. and it's sort of obvious that that's what it would be, right? That it would be those two that would be the final winners in
it's really interesting to speculate that far out. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things about that series, just in the whole way of it's a group of people kind of living together on a spaceship, trying to find some sort of meaning in life. And the group of people are representative of different categories of people. One of them is called the shepherd. So he's kind of like a pastor. Mm-hmm. And one of them is a prostitute who in that era becomes, they actually call her an ambassador. Mm-hmm. They're licensed and they actually have a very high place in society in that era. And then of course there's the captain of the ship, and he has a very ripe and interesting backstory. And then there's a doctor and his sister. So I mean, there's all these categories of people represented by these characters, and it's fascinating. It's I mean, I think it's a tragedy that it only had one season. I really do, because it's amazing. I've watched it probably 4 times, but
oh wow,
yeah,
that good.
It's that good. It's that good. Well, I do think that we kind of wrapped it up.
Yeah.
Except there's one little thing right at the end that I thought was really fascinating. He says, nature as such involves the absence. I'm going to parse it out a little bit because it's too complicated a sentence. Nature involves the absence of individual human activity, and history involves the presence of individual human activity. But if we maintain, or if we imagine or suppose, which is perhaps the commoner failing, that such phenomena as language and myth are themselves the products of individual human activity. This is where he gets talking about. But I just thought this little thing he slotted in there is that supposing is the commoner failing. You can imagine or you can suppose, but to suppose is a common failing of human beings. I thought that was a very interesting thing that he just slipped in there, because
That goes back to the two-ness.
yeah,
It's just easier to slide into a sort of default assumption and not really critically imagine it, but just kind of notice that everybody else seems to be assuming it as well. So it's like, yeah, this is good. This is it. This must be true.
yeah, I thought that was, to me, that kind of summed up the whole chapter, is that what we've fallen into is supposing about everything. And in one sense, we certainly have adopted imagination, from the sense that he's talking about imagination, meaning making images. We've put ourselves in the creative position of being the ones who make images, whether we're making images of what the future is supposed to look like, or make images of AI and what, intelligence is supposed to look like, or whatever. But we're also the people who are supposing all the time.
Which is scary. But I do think that will come to an end. I mean, like it's funny because we're at the cusp of something where, like, we in the history of humanity, we've never had such a wealth of capability to really look deeply into the past. Never had this kind of opportunity before, and the luxury of the free time and the resources of a civilization to do that. But we've never been so bad in terms of our flattening out and the kind of compressing of the complexity of that past into very stupid and silly tropes and a very kind of cartoonish versions of what actually occurred, right? But I think that's going to have to change at some point, because I think we're going to kind of these we've taken the reductionistic method as far as it's going to go, and that mechanistic understanding of everything is just going to it's going to kind of show itself to have run its course, and then the time, the tools is rife for like a real reinvigoration, a real reenchantment of both the past, but also how we apply those lessons to the future.
Well, I, for one, am excited about the future of this book, because we get to do chapter 4 next time. And I also did want to say that I'm going to put in the show notes both the interview with Bishop Barron and the episode from three brown and one blue, or 3 blue and 1 brown, where he's talking about the 2-ness and 3-ness and boundaries, because I thought it was so fascinating. And if there's anything else you want me to put in there, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just link to the book, and we'll have to have another episode on this.
Sounds good. This was fun.
Always fascinating to hear your ideas, Michael. And I do think here. You should start publishing some of your writing, because you're very gifted.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I'm looking into it. So we'll see what comes of that.
Okay.
All right.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.